Tony is the former president of RSL Queensland. He's also a former member of the Royal Australian Air Force and a member of the New South Wales Police Force. Tony, welcome to Australian National News.
Thanks very much, Eamon.
Tony, for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and what's brought you here today?
Yeah, sure. As you've heard, Tony's the name. I've been involved with the RSL since 2010, basically because I had no idea what the RSL was. So my wife suggested I should become a member of a sub-branch. I thought I was a member of an RSL just by having that $5 card. But unbeknownst to me, there was a lot more to the league than what was just pints, palmies and pokies. So I got involved with the organisation, the league, back in 2010. Moved into a role at a sub-branch where I became a committee member quite early on in the piece. Moved into some administrative roles within the sub-branch and elevated into the district presidency. Of course, then into the board of RSL Queensland and onto the board of National.
Can you tell us a little bit about your time in the Air Force and then the New South Wales Police Force?
Sure. So 1979, I joined the Royal Australian Air Force after being given a choice by my mother to get out of the house and go and get a job. And I didn't want to work real hard, so it was the Air Force I chose.
Yeah.
And subsequently had 6 years in the Air Force. That for me was a stepping stone into the New South Wales Police Force, where I worked for 14 years in various roles and subsequently discharged medically hurt on duty, medically unfit, and subsequently retired from the New South Wales Police Force, which was ideal because it then gave me an opportunity to get involved in volunteering.
Okay. And your volunteering then led you all the way through to become RSL Queensland president. Can you tell us how long were you the president for, and what do you think was your biggest success in that role?
Sure. So 2014, I moved into the boardroom as a district president. So in Queensland, you were elevated to the role of the state board by becoming elected as a district president. So moved into the boardroom in 2014. 2018 was elected to the role of state president. So for me, it was about actually trying to fix the issues within the RSL in Queensland. So we were at that time under a directions notice from the ACNC. My role, along with the board of RSL Queensland, was to clear that directions notice as soon as we possibly could. But I think the bigger thing for me was actually about the profit that RSL Queensland was making and how we should be putting that profit back into veterans and their families. So when I first got to the board, it was around 14% of company's profit, which was going back to help veterans and families. And I think when I left, it was around 47%. So that was one of the big things for me, was to actually look after veterans and their families as a result of the income that was coming in to generate that for those people. So,
in terms of that income, what sort of turnaround were you able to achieve in your time as president?
So 2014 moved in. We were around 80 to 90,000. 80 to 90 million a year turnover then, and now it's up around 200 to 220 million a year turnover.
Right.
So and of course RSL Queensland carries this great RSL Art Union, which is considered the largest art union in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Many of our watchers and listeners and readers might not realise, but you're actually one of the nominees this year for the RSL Australia National presidency. What's the path that's led you to there? What do you think you can achieve in that role, and why do you want to be the president of RSL Australia?
Look, I think for the same reasons I took on the role in Queensland, and that's to actually get into the grassroots of the organisation and fix it. It's got some problems. Ideally, its lobbying, its advocacy issues really need to be fixed up. RSL National needs to be standing with the states and presenting to government and defence leaders on these issues that are very important to veterans and their families. So for me, that's the big thing. It's about fixing the organisation, getting back to actually being the voice of the veterans and the lead ESO, actually going forward, embracing the other ESOs in this journey, bringing them together and speaking all as one voice.
Okay. I mean, you've just mentioned some of the issues there. What do you anticipate as big friction points for you if you were elected national president?
Look, I think the friction points are going to be that let's not go too fast. Yes, we need change, but I think we actually need to fix the foundation. Yeah. Let's get back, fix the foundation, and then we can reconstruct the walls. We've got a great frame. Let's build around the frame going forward and make it stronger. The friction points, I think, is there's going to be pushback. and there'll be pushback from those that are not open to change. I think one of the biggest friction points is because we've been silent, we're going to see a lot of pushback once we become vocal.
It's a really great point you make there. So, were you elected, what do you anticipate RSL Australia would look like within 18 months? By the end of 2023, for example, how would you want to change that organisation?
So I normally work, I've stolen it from the US presidency, but I normally work on a 100-day policy. So there's certain things I like to set within 100 days. You know, that first 3 months is very important to lay that foundation going forward. I think my biggest concern is that we don't lose sight of what we're here for. And I think we've generally tend to lost that going forward in this whole process. Let's get back, grassroots, start again. So what I'd like to see is the community, the ESO community, become one. And I think we've got thousands of ex-service organisations out there. Yes, they do different things, but we should all be working together. The veteran community should be borderless. There shouldn't be us doing this, them doing that. We should all be working together to achieve the same goals for the same people, veterans and their families.
Yeah. And you've mentioned that ESO community, that veteran community. What do you see as the strength of the veteran community?
Well, the strength of the veteran community is the veterans and their passion for their work and their people. The camaraderie, those ideals that the military, the Australian military bases itself on, I think is very important, and that carries into the RSL. That's what the RSL is here for. Yeah,
there's obviously a lot of passion here. What you've mentioned some of the issues within the RSL. You've mentioned those friction points. What should we be excited about?
Look, I think there's good opportunity to be excited about change. If it's not one person can fix this problem, though. It's everybody. It's everybody that is involved with the organisation called the Return and Services League, and to an extent, those external service organisations as well. They need to be all coming together to serve these veterans and their families. So for me, it's let's take a bite, let's go and fight together, but break down these barriers of us and them. I know it's a defence trade, you know, Army, Navy, Air Force, we always do these things and we dig at each other, and we still do that in the RSL. But at the end of the day, we need to actually brush that aside, because our goal is veterans and their families and achieving what we need for a better standard of living, quality of life for those individuals.
Yeah. You've said service there quite a few times. How important is service for you?
So service for me was very important. It was, you know, that choice, get out and get a job or join defence. Back then it was the long piece, so it was just a case of joining defence. Yeah. I fired a lot of shots when I was in the Air Force, but they were generally basketball shots. They weren't with rifles. But, you know, at the end of the day, the camaraderie and the lifestyle of defence was absolutely fantastic, and that still carries on in this organisation. And I saw it on a daily basis as the state president of Queensland, and I still see it as the vice president of the Sunshine Coast. Everybody just wants to be together, and when you see veterans together, just the camaraderie and the remembering. And I relate to your story that you published last week in relation to your march on Anzac Day and being with the CAV guys on that march. That's very important. But that generational age gap of, you know, some 20, 30 years is very important. And the sheer fact that you wore the same beret makes you family. So I think that's very important.
And you mentioned there your time in RSL Queensland as the president. You were known as a bit of a hallway creeper back then. Can you tell us a little bit about why you got that reputation?
So it's about being grassroots, and I think there was a very intentional, I think, misunderstanding in Anzac House. So they'd go to work for one reason, was to make money for the organisation. When I got in, it was about actually working for the veterans and their families. And I used to walk through the corridors and speak to the staff and say, look, go home tonight knowing that the work you do today is going to help a veteran and their family. That actually has seen an encouragement, especially at Anzac House in Queensland, where staff are now going out and joining reserve, becoming reservists in defence. So they're actually becoming embodied into the organisation, even though they may not have had military experience. But a good number of the staff at Anzac House in Queensland are ex-military. So, you know, but it's a bond. It's just a bond that can't be broken.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's a really important point. You're talking about a number of things, but you're talking about that time you spent in the hallways, thanking people for their service, making sure people were appreciated. For you, and you've you sort of hinted towards it. How hard is it for you as the RSL Queensland president, as a district president now, as someone who is really involved with an ESO on a personal level? How much time is this taking up of yours? How much of your emotions, your mental spirit is invested in this organisation?
Yeah, good question. And I think it's very important because you're volunteering for a very, very good cause. So time really becomes irrelevant. And it does. It becomes really relevant as to how much time you spend. My policy was if somebody rang me at any time, then they deserved me to pick up the phone. That was my idea. I would always do that. But time commitment, some weeks you'd work anything up to 70 hours away from home a lot, which totally understand. I'm lucky I have a wife who understands. I would always sit down with her prior to nominating for these positions, and we would talk about the process. But it's time consuming. The kids are no longer at home, so that's good. I've got a couple of dogs that hate me every time I leave and lick me to death every time I come home. But yeah, look, it's a commitment and it's a full-time commitment.
Yeah, and I imagine there's a number of state presidents now around Australia within the RSL who are still working full-time.
Yes.
One of the things I've heard you speak about is a national framework.
Yes.
How would that apply to those states? In terms of those state presidents who are still working, is that a way, your idea, to sort of minimise the amount of work they're undertaking, minimise their personal pressures? Is that something that you can sort of thought about?
Look, I'd never dare manage another state president. I think that's something they need to do for themselves. And you get commitment from a lot of state presidents giving 100% because they have the capability. I understand that other state presidents have families, they still need income, and unfortunately volunteering doesn't pay for that. So, I would never proffer that they should be doing something different. They obviously need to give the same level of commitment, and I'm sure they do, and I'm sure they will. But it's just a case of managing the time, which becomes very, very difficult.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about that, the idea of that national framework?
Look, the national framework, I think, is we have this capability within each of the states where certain services are provided within those states. So the question I ask myself is, why are we not sharing those services throughout the states? Why can't I go from my sub-branch at Kawana Waters on the Sunshine Coast to this sub-branch here in Hawthorn, for argument's sake, and receive the same level of service and capability that I get at Kawana or in Queensland for that matter? But Victoria does great things down here as well. So why is Victoria not sharing those services with other states as well? It should be, I should be able to walk into any sub-branch in this country and receive the same level of service, same level of advocacy, same level of wellbeing, same level of support through any sub-branch in this country.
Yeah, and we do seem to operate in silos. There's little empires and
yes,
people don't want to share the information. In terms of, I mean, you've talked about national framework. How hard is it going to be to achieve that? How hard do you think it is to get that sort of thing through?
As I said, mate, it's not a one-person job. It's got to be everybody committed to the cause, and the cause is very important. We've lost the cause. And that became very apparent because we rolled into a Royal Commission, and we now have a Royal Commission which is partway through in determining better ways to look after our veterans and families. And after watching the Royal Commission at length, there are a lot of people indicating that the RSL actually needs to step up and help.
So what are your biggest takeouts so far from the Royal Commission?
Oh, look, what I've indicated previously, we're not aligned. We have these borders, silos, as you've called them, and we actually need to break down these borders and these silos to be the peak body organisation in this country, communicate better. Speak on those issues rather than be pushed to speak on those issues. Be the lead voice. Yeah. But also be the lead voice on behalf of the membership. It's not about an individual making commentary, it's about the organisation on behalf of its members making commentary.
So for a veteran, middle of nowhere, Queensland has no interest in the RSL or any other ESO, why should they be interested in the RSL, in an ESO? Why does Tony Ferris want them to join the RSL?
Look, I think it goes hand in hand. I believe our forefathers established the RSL for that reason. For those that served, and for those that come home, the like-mindedness, the camaraderie, those ethos and ideals of the organisation going forward. So I think it's important that we continue that on historically. We've been around for 105 years. You mentioned the RSL, and it's up there in history. It's remembered by Australians. Census tells us that 1 in 5 homes have a relationship to the military one way or another. That's a massive demographic within the country.
But how do you think the country views veterans?
Look, I think the country owns their veterans, and they're very, very open arms, responsible, and respect them. And that becomes very obvious on these commemorative days such as Anzac Day and Remembrance Day. And we're seeing massive numbers turn out at these events. So I think, why would a veteran want to join the RSL? I think veterans should join the RSL. Anybody in the military should join the RSL. And I'm a firm believer it should be a cradle-to-grave process. From the day they get into boot camp to the day we do a poppy service for them at their funeral, they should be associated with the RSL in one way or another. We may not be able to help everybody, but at the end of the day, it's part of that ethos. It's part of that. It's part of being in the military, I think.
I really want to go into that point about, you've mentioned communication earlier, you've mentioned how the community views their veteran, but before we go into that cradle to the grave mentality, can you give us an example of how that would work, or how you see that working in an ideal world?
Look, again, I think it's one of those situations where we need to be careful. So certain states will have different ideas on how they believe people should be members within the organisation. I ideally think that to be a member of this organisation called the Return Services League, it should be free. It should be zero, all right? You are entitled to be a member of the organisation. Why should you not be a member of the organisation? So the boot camp, in there one day, and DVA says, 1 day of service, you're injured, guess what? We'll look after you. So from that process, why then is the RSL not involved from day one? Through all the way, whether it be through advocacy processes, looking after them financially, providing them with transition to employment. These are all big things that we're hearing. Education, wives that have been sitting at home, or partners that have been sitting at home whilst others have deployed. Why we should be helping those families to reintegrate back into community. Lots of people, lots of partners have been debilitated by military service because they haven't been able to expand their working career, their educational standards, those sorts of things. So why not give them the opportunity to take that path to expand their lives?
What you're saying, though, are you concerned that some of what you're saying is reaching into the role of DVA? So we're sort of almost stepping out of our role as an ESO, and we're filling a gap. There's a gap in the market, there's a gap in the service delivery to veterans and those who are serving. Are you concerned that the RSL is stepping into that gap that DVA isn't providing?
I think RSL has to step into the gap.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is we have 40,000 people in need of DVA assistance with 60,000 claims sitting there. That's atrocious. Yeah. What impact to the mental health of those individuals waiting to find out what's going to happen for the rest of their lives? So I think we do have to actually step into that role, and we do have to advocate very harshly for those individuals, because here we are halfway through a Royal Commission and we're hearing about the suicide impact. The causality of those issues sometimes are going to stem from the issues of, well, where am I going? I've got no financial income. My health is debilitated. I've got no support from DVA. So, yeah, I think RSL has to actually step into those parts to take over.
And I mean, on the topic of DVA and those putting those claims in the backlog of claims, what are your thoughts on we have 3 main acts at the moment. We've got someone like yourself would be covered under VEA, someone like myself is covered under MERCA. We have there's something like 42 acts of pieces of legislation that govern veterans. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on what role the RSL should be playing in almost cleaning up that system?
Look, great point. I think the RSL now actually has to readdress this process and streamline and force a streamline in the process so that people like you and me that have these issues can actually address them in a timely manner. I'm hearing some claims up to 2 or 3 years, some even longer to be processed, and that's not good for anybody's health. But I think the role for the RSL is going to change in the future as well, because somebody's actually going to have to step in and fill that void. Somebody's actually going to have to cradle those individuals that need that assistance. It's occurring now. And, I thank the grassroots of the organisation, those volunteers to advocate at the grassroots level of the organisation. I don't profess to have any knowledge about VA, Merck or Durka, but there are a lot of people out there who spend that time with those individuals. And let's be honest about it, there's got to be some residual feedback to those individuals that are volunteering to work with those individuals as well. Residual PTSD has got to be something we've got to watch out for those individuals as well. What protection mechanisms do we have in place for that?
I think it's a really good point. I think it's something that we skip over a lot of the time, that PTSD is a really broad brush term, and there's people who've got severe PTSD, there's people who've got PTSD related to their war service, absolutely. But there's also, I think it's a great point, is the trauma of dealing with the rejection of claims, the trauma of dealing with people who are broken and damaged from their service day in, day out, repeatedly. Those advocates are having a really tough time. For me, I find the idea of an advocate really interesting. We have an adversarial system at Sames with DVA where our veterans have to engage an advocate in order to get their claims. How do you feel about that sort of process?
Look, you've got solicitors out there which are charging phenomenal amounts of money to veterans for that one-off lump sum payment, and that can be debilitating for an individual going forward. So we actually need to address the process. You've got people who are volunteering, there are people who are charging veterans to do that advocacy work. We've got to manage that. I know in RSL Queensland we used to challenge individuals that were charged because volunteers were doing it free of charge.
Yeah.
And in fact, RSL Queensland paid staff were doing it free of charge. But that's what they should be doing. That's the intent of it. But, somebody young getting out of defence sees the dollar signs attached to discharge with injury. I'll take the lump sum and run. Not looking to the future, and we don't. It's that 10-foot tall and bulletproof syndrome that we all have, military, male, Australian. Nothing can hurt us, nothing can harm us. So we actually work for now, and we look for now. We don't look to the future.
In terms of now, we're looking at the Royal Commission at the moment. There's a lot of information coming out about the Defence Force now. Mm-hmm. How do you feel, when do you think the Royal Commission will start looking at a more historic view? I mean, suicidality within defence has been high since before the First World War. We have evidence, thanks to one of your RSL Queensland employees, of service members, I say service members, is the wrong word, but veterans, a veteran who returned from the First World War who came here to Melbourne and shot himself on the east of the Yarra in 1901. Are you concerned that the Royal Commission is too focused on the now rather than the historic aspect, or do you think the two will work together and they will address that historic aspect?
Look, I've done my research on the commissioners, and I know Commissioner Callis through his role in the New South Wales Police. But I think the commissioners will come back. I hope that they come back with good decision-making processes. I just hope that the governments take on board what the Royal Commission recommends. What I'm seeing through the recordings is very good gathering of evidence. But let's see what comes out. We've had all these reports come out. Certain actions have been taken. Not everything's been fulfilled. If the Royal Commission makes recommendations, then government has to actually do something about those recommendations. Otherwise, it just becomes a cost spending. Yeah.
And within that, what do you see RSL's role then if those recommendations are made?
Look, I think RSL has to step up and be the lead peak organisation, but it also has to embrace the other ex-service organisations. It has to understand that there are other ex-service organisations which do things differently. It's not about reinventing the wheel, it's about embracing those ex-service organisations to bring what they bring to the table so that everybody can work. And the services, why are we not sharing those services? It should be shared everywhere, borderless.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, so bringing it back, you mentioned earlier, you talked about the community have a great fondness for veterans, they own their veterans. You mentioned that communication piece. How do you feel, so you've talked about how you want to communicate more, how do you feel the public will receive a more active RSL Australia if you were the president? How do you feel people will respond to an RSL that would be publicly standing up and lobbying?
Yeah, look, the community, I think, will understand, but there's an education process within the community which needs to be done. And I've spoken a lot about it. It's about the RSL versus the clubs. And it's this community understanding, and the RSLs have done great work, and the clubs have done great work because they've taken an iconic name and they've made money off it. and they've made good money off it in the clubs. They donate back into community, which they're supposed to do, and that's fine. But it's the pints, palmies and pokies versus the pensions, advocacy and welfare. And this is the RSL. This is what it was originally for back when our forefathers started this organisation. So that's, and we actually need to educate our community that this is what the RSL does. This is the service they provide as far as entertainment, gambling, alcohol, food, that's fine. But this is the paramount, this is the important part, the pensions, advocacy and the welfare.
And it's a bit different in Victoria. In Victoria, we have, the gaming clubs, 51 of them in Victoria. The sub-branch is that gaming club. It's a bit different in Queensland and New South Wales. I know it was a big issue for you as your time as president. How much of the public do you think understand the difference between clubs and RSLs? What's clubs and sub-branches in Queensland and New South Wales?
Sure. So one of my wishes when I was in Queensland presidency was to actually educate the public about what the RSL does. So an advertising campaign was commenced. That advertising campaign still runs today, and it talks about what the RSL does. It talks about transition to employment, homelessness, scholarship programs, all those issues that are important to somebody who's getting out of service, looking for the rest of their life. Bearing in mind that when somebody joins at the age of 17 into the army, it may not necessarily be the lifelong career that they want. They may do it for 5, 8 years, 10 years, and that be it. But then they want to move on to something else. So I believe that RSL should be engaging in that transition. That start the day that somebody says, I'm leaving defence, that's when RSL should be assisting them in that process of transitioning out. And that may be some 2 years before they leave military. But let's get those individuals trained into and get them skills, training in a job that is going to give them a future going forward. It's just a no-brainer. We need to be there to help.
How did you see in your time as president with that advertising campaign, with that increased communication, with those news releases you did? What in terms of membership, what sort of engagement did you reach? Did you gain more membership in RSL Queensland? Did you notice that cut through that you were getting? So
not in Queensland, we didn't, and the reason was because we had this attrition rate. So we have our older veterans who are moving into the darker regions, but we don't see that level of increase of the younger veterans coming in to fill that void. And the expectation is that they will come along eventually. They may come along, but you can't force them. But I think you will encapsulate a lot more people by starting at the boot camp, so the cradle to grave process. You join defence, you're a member of the league.
Yeah. I wonder though, in terms of that engagement, in terms of bringing those members in, are you concerned that the RSL isn't going to attract members? Are you concerned that the value proposition for people just isn't there and they're not going to join?
Look, I don't think we can be concerned. Look, the RSL will always be here. I just think if we're not careful, it will become irrelevant.
Right. Yeah, it's a dangerous concept, isn't it? It's a scary concept.
Mm-hmm.
Tony, I think we're almost out of time. I've got one more question for you. We haven't touched this, I hope, but what's something that we're not talking about within the RSL and within the veteran sphere that we really should know?
Yeah, look, tough question. I think it's about caring. That to me is the important part. There needs to be a care factor. If somebody comes to you and say they've got a problem, it shouldn't be just brushed aside as, well, we'll get around to it. We actually need to be embracing it immediately and looking at all the aspects. So through the Queensland programs, I know that what they do there is it's a holistic program. So let's take somebody living on the streets, a veteran living on the streets, sleeping on a park bench. That process then is, well, let's get that person off the park bench. So they're immediately got a roof over their head, whether it be motel accommodation for a period of time, starting on the 3 square meals. So 3 square meals, comfort, a roof over their head. They're then engaged into another organisation, which RSL Queensland supports, and that organisation then takes over looking after them and placing them into accommodation. So around that, you've then got, well, what's the financial stability of this individual? Are they self-medicating? Those sorts of things. So RSL Queensland will then go down the process of assisting in fixing these issues. It doesn't always work, but at the end of the day, people need to know that it's there for them should they go down that path. But it's holistic, better management of their income, looking at these issues of self-medication, the fact of getting your own self-esteem back, bearing in mind that we all used to wear a pressed uniform and they used to boot our ass if it wasn't. But getting that self-esteem back, and I remember spit polished shoes, this, that, and the other thing on parade, having the self-esteem standing there and those VIPs walking past on an inspection. But we actually need to get that back for these individuals that lose their self-esteem and their meaning.
It's a great point. I think, an organisation that cares is an organisation that we can all be part of.
Yeah.
Tony Ferris, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone who watches this has enjoyed it. All the best in September.
Thank you.
I do hope, good luck.
Thanks very much for your time.
Great.